The first time anyone whispered that Gideon could harvest another person's luck, people laughed because they believed envy always searched for excuses whenever one man prospered more than his neighbors. His fields stretched farther every season, while everyone else's seemed to shrink beneath the same relentless sun. His granaries overflowed when nearby families struggled to gather enough maize for another month. His cattle grew fat during years when disease wandered across the valley like an invisible hunter. Visitors admired his success, elders praised his discipline, and strangers traveled from distant villages hoping to learn the secrets behind his remarkable harvests. Gideon always welcomed them with a calm smile, offering simple answers about waking before dawn, trusting the soil, and fearing God more than drought. Yet, after every conversation, another family somewhere in the valley found itself trapped inside a season of misfortune that seemed almost impossible to explain. Healthy crops suddenly yellowed overnight. A pregnant cow died without warning. A promising marriage collapsed days before the wedding. Children who had always laughed began falling strangely quiet. It happened so often that people eventually stopped calling these events coincidence. They lowered their voices whenever Gideon's name entered a conversation. Even the wind seemed reluctant to carry those whispers across the hills. In the center of that same valley lived a young farmer named Jabari, whose greatest treasure was not the small piece of land left by his late father, but the hope that one honest season could change everything for his widowed mother and younger sister. His farm was tiny compared with Gideon's estate, yet every row of maize stood straight because his hands cared for each seed as though it carried his family's future. The villagers respected Jabari because he never measured success by wealth alone. Whenever an elderly neighbor struggled to repair a roof, he appeared before sunrise with fresh timber. When children lost goats in the forest, he searched until darkness covered the hills. If a widow lacked enough grain, he quietly left a sack outside her door without expecting thanks. His kindness became so ordinary that people rarely noticed it anymore. They simply assumed Jabari would always help because that was who he was. His mother often warned him that generous hearts attracted greedy eyes. Jabari laughed every time she said it. He believed goodness could never become dangerous. One warm afternoon, as the harvest season approached, the village gathered for the annual blessing of the fields. Men carried baskets filled with fresh maize, while women sang old songs their grandmothers had taught them decades earlier. The air smelled of roasted cassava, smoke, and rain waiting beyond the distant mountains. Children chased each other between rows of colorful fabric hanging from market stalls. Elders prayed that every family would receive enough to survive another year. Gideon arrived, dressed in spotless white robes that reflected the afternoon sunlight. People stepped aside almost automatically, making room for the valley's richest farmer. He greeted everyone politely, smiling with practiced warmth, yet his eyes wandered across the gathering as though searching for something hidden among the crowd. They finally settled on Jabari. The young farmer stood beside his mother, laughing as his little sister proudly displayed the first perfect ear of maize they had harvested together. It was not the largest ear in the village, nor the finest, but the happiness shining across their faces made it appear more valuable than gold. Gideon's smile faded for only a heartbeat before returning exactly as it had been. Hardly anyone noticed the change, except an elderly herbalist named Mama Safia. She has spent more than 70 years watching people reveal themselves through expressions they believed lasted too briefly for others to see. She watched Gideon's eyes narrow almost imperceptibly before he walked toward Jabari with open arms. "You have done well," Gideon said, placing both hands firmly on the younger man's shoulders. Your father would be proud. Jabari thanked him respectfully. Gideon's hands lingered just a little longer than necessary before he stepped away. Mama Safia frowned without understanding why that brief gesture unsettled her. It looked harmless. It felt ordinary. Yet something inside her old heart whispered that kindness offered at precisely the right moment could sometimes hide the sharpest blade. 3 days later, Jabari's maize began dying. At first, only a few leaves curled strangely despite healthy soil. Then, entire rows turned gray before sunrise. By the end of the week, nearly half his field looked as though invisible fire had passed through. Neighbors inspected the land, but found no insects, no disease, and no obvious cause. They offered sympathy because that was all they could give. Jabari refused despair. He worked harder, watering each plant by hand from the nearby river until his shoulders burned with exhaustion. His mother prayed every evening while his sister gathered herbs believed to strengthen damaged crops. Nothing changed. Instead, the destruction spread faster than anyone believed possible. At the same time, Gideon's fields became greener than ever. Travelers passing through the valley marveled at the astonishing difference between neighboring farms. Some joked that the rain itself preferred Gideon's land. Others laughed nervously before falling silent, remembering the old rumors they had dismissed for years. Mama Safia visited Jabari, one quiet morning, carrying a small woven basket filled with medicinal roots. She knelt beside the dying maize, touched the cracked earth, and closed her eyes. After several long moments, she stood without speaking. Jabari asked what troubled her. The old woman hesitated because certain fears became stronger once spoken aloud. Finally, she answered in a voice barely louder than the breeze. "Your soil is alive," she said. "Your water is clean. Your hands have done everything correctly. Yet your harvest behaves as though it has forgotten it belongs to you." Jabari looked at her with confusion. "How can a harvest forget its owner?" She sighed deeply. "Long ago, our ancestors warned that greed never steals only cattle or land. Sometimes it tries to steal hope itself." Before Jabari could ask another question, she quietly walked away, leaving him staring across his ruined field. That night sleep refused to visit him. He sat outside beneath a sky crowded with stars, while memories of happier seasons drifted through his mind. He remembered his father's laughter echoing across these same fields, his promise that honest work always carried its own reward, and his final words before illness claimed him. "Protect your heart," his father had whispered, because once bitterness enters a farmer's soul, even good soil begins to fear him. Jabari repeated those words until dawn, forcing himself to believe tomorrow would somehow bring an answer. Instead, the next morning delivered another cruel surprise. His strongest ox lay dead beside the watering hole without a single wound upon his body. The villagers gathered in stunned silence. Some crossed themselves in prayer, while others refused to meet Jabari's eyes. Fear had begun replacing sympathy. They no longer believed simple misfortune followed him. They wondered whether something darker had settled over his family. Across the valley, Gideon's workers celebrated the birth of 3 healthy calves on the very same morning. The coincidence spread through the marketplace before sunset, growing stranger with every retelling. By evening, people were once again whispering that Gideon never became fortunate by accident. They whispered that every blessing arriving at his gate always seemed to disappear from someone else's doorstep first. And for the first time in his life, Jabari found himself wondering whether luck could truly be stolen by a man who had learned to hide his greed behind a gentle smile. The whispers that had once drifted through the village like harmless smoke now settled over every home with frightening weight. mothers put their children indoors before sunset. Farmers stopped celebrating successful harvests too loudly, fearing that joy itself might invite unwanted attention. Whenever Gideon's cart rolled through the marketplace, conversations ended abruptly. Faces smiled politely, but eyes looked away. No one wanted to offend the wealthiest man in the valley, yet no one felt comfortable standing too close to him anymore. Gideon noticed the change, though he behaved as if nothing had happened. His greetings remained warm, his gifts to the village generous, and his donations to the temple larger than ever. Outwardly, he appeared to be the perfect example of prosperity shared with others. Privately, however, he watched every frightened glance with quiet satisfaction. Fear was easier to control than respect. Jabari refused to surrender to the rumors. He still believed there had to be a logical explanation for everything that had happened. Every morning before dawn, he inspected his fields again, searching for insects, poisoned water, damaged roots, or anything that could explain why healthy crops had collapsed so suddenly. He dug into the soil until his fingernails bled. He carried samples to neighboring villages where experienced farmers examined them carefully. Each one reached the same conclusion. The earth was fertile. The seeds had been healthy. Water showed no sign of contamination. Nothing explained the disaster. The mystery only deepened. His savings disappeared, one coin at a time, as he tried to save what little remained of his farm. His mother quietly sewed the gold earrings she had received on her wedding day so they could buy fresh seed. His younger sister stopped attending school so she could help gather firewood and work beside him from sunrise until darkness covered the hills. Not once did either of them complain. Their silent sacrifices hurt Jabari more than hunger ever could. He felt as though he had failed the people he loved most. One evening, Mama Safia returned, carrying an old leather pouch that looked almost as ancient as she was. Placed it gently on Jabari's table without saying a word. Inside were several faded journals written by her grandfather, who had served as one of the valley's respected record keepers nearly 80 years earlier. Pages smelled of smoke, dust, and age. Their edges crumbled beneath careful fingers. Together they began reading by lantern light. At first, the journals described ordinary seasons, weddings, births, and droughts. Then Jabari found a passage that made the room suddenly feel colder. It spoke of another wealthy landowner who had lived generations before Gideon. According to the journal, that man had become rich whenever neighboring families mysteriously lost everything. Crops failed beside flourishing estates. Healthy livestock died while his own multiplied. The villagers lived, possessed supernatural power, until one elder uncovered a far more disturbing truth. The wealthy farmer had secretly bribed desperate laborers to poison neighboring wells, scatter destructive insects into nearby fields, till valuable seed before planting season, and spread false stories that frightened families into abandoning productive land. Every disaster appeared mysterious only because the victims never imagined someone would patiently create their misfortune. Piece by piece, Jabari read the passage 3 times before lifting his eyes. So, the stories about stolen luck were never really about magic, he whispered. Mama Safia nodded slowly. Greed often disguises itself as something supernatural because fear prevents people from asking practical questions. The realization struck Jabari like lightning. If someone wanted the village to believe luck could be stolen, then every unexplained tragedy might actually have been carefully arranged by human hands. Suddenly, Gideon's extraordinary success looked less miraculous than calculated. They spent the following days quietly investigating instead of accusing. Barry spoke with shepherds, traders, and former workers who had once been employed on Gideon's enormous estate. Most were too frightened to speak openly. Some denied knowing anything at all. Others simply walked away whenever Gideon's name entered the conversation. Finally, an elderly stable hand agreed to meet Jabari after midnight near an abandoned grain mill outside the village. The old man arrived with trembling hands and eyes that constantly searched the darkness behind him. He insisted no lantern be lit. "People think Gideon steals luck," the old man whispered. "The truth is worse, because ordinary men can copy what he does." Jabari remained silent, allowing him to continue. Every season, Gideon sends trusted workers into neighboring villages, disguised as traders or laborers. They learn which families expect the best harvests. They discover who owns the healthiest cattle and who has finally escaped death. Then the accidents begin. The stable hand described sacks of insects secretly released into promising fields, irrigation channels blocked during the night, seed stores quietly contaminated with mold, false deaths created through bribed officials, valuable breeding animals stolen and replaced with sick ones. When frightened families became desperate enough to sell their land cheaply, Gideon purchased everything through intermediaries, so no one realized who truly benefited. The villagers believed fortune naturally flowed toward him because they never saw the invisible chain connecting their losses to his victories. Jabari listened in stunned silence. Every story matched another unexplained tragedy people had accepted for years. The old man lowered his voice even further. He calls it harvesting luck because frightened people stop investigating once they believe spirits are involved. Before Jabari could ask another question, footsteps echoed somewhere beyond the mill. The stable hand's face turned pale. Without another word, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Jabari alone beneath the broken roof. The next morning, the old man's family announced that he had packed his belongings before sunrise and left the valley forever. Nobody believed the explanation, but nobody challenged it either. Fear had become stronger than curiosity. Jabari realized he now possessed enough suspicion to endanger himself, but not enough proof to expose Gideon. If he accused the wealthy farmer without evidence, the entire village would dismiss him as a bitter man searching for someone to blame. Worse still, Gideon would know exactly who had begun asking dangerous questions. That evening, Jabari climbed the highest hill overlooking the valley. From there, he could see Gideon's estate glowing with lanterns, while dozens of workers moved between overflowing granaries. On the opposite side lay scattered homes where families quietly counted their remaining grain, wondering how another season had slipped away from them. For the first time, Jabari stopped seeing isolated tragedies. He saw a pattern stretching across years, carefully hidden beneath generosity, reputation, and fear. His father had once taught him that the strongest fences were not built from wood, but from silence. Gideon had surrounded himself with exactly that kind of fence. Every frightened villager added another piece to it by refusing to speak. Every unexplained disaster made the legend stronger. Every whispered story about stolen luck protected the man creating those disasters with ordinary grit. Jabari clenched his fist as the evening wind swept across the hill. He finally understood that defeating Gideon would require more than exposing one crime. He would have to destroy the terrifying myth that had protected the wealthy farmer for years. Until the villagers stopped believing their luck could be harvested like maize from a field, they would never find the courage to face the man who had been harvesting something far more valuable all along: their fear. Jabari knew truth alone would never defeat Gideon. The villagers had lived with fear for too many years, and fear rarely disappeared after a single accusation. He needed proof that everyone could see with their own eyes. Quietly, he gathered a handful of trusted farmers whose families had suffered the same mysterious disasters. Instead of speaking openly, they watched Gideon's workers from a distance. They marked every wagon that left his estate after dark. They followed unfamiliar laborers who visited neighboring farms just before planting season. Night after night, the pattern became impossible to ignore. One evening, they caught two of Gideon's men emptying sacks filled with destructive insects into a healthy maize field. Another night, they discovered irrigation channels being blocked with heavy stones. They found hidden stores of stolen seed buried inside an abandoned shed connected to Gideon's estate. Every piece of evidence was carefully documented before the village elders were secretly invited to witness the next attempt. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Just before sunrise, Gideon's most trusted foreman slipped into the farm of a widow whose harvest promised to be the best in years. Hidden among the trees, Jabari, the elders, and several villagers watched as the man spread mold through her seed storage and prepared to disappear unnoticed. Before he could escape, they stepped into the open. The foreman froze. Faced with undeniable witnesses, his courage vanished. He confessed everything. He admitted that Gideon had ordered years of sabotage against hardworking families, buying their ruined land for almost nothing after their fortunes collapsed. The stories of stolen luck had been encouraged deliberately because frightened people never search for ordinary criminals behind extraordinary legends. By noon, the entire village had gathered in the central square. For the first time, Gideon stood before his neighbors without the protection of wealth or reputation. One by one, former workers confirmed the foreman's story. Families suddenly understood that their suffering had never been a curse. Their luck had not been harvested by magic. Their futures had been stolen by calculated greed. Gideon tried to deny every accusation, but each new witness shattered another lie until silence replaced his confident voice. The village elders stripped him of the lands he had acquired through fraud and returned much of the property to the families who had lost it. Those who could not recover their farms received grain, livestock, and tools from the reclaimed estate, so they could begin again. Gideon was ordered to leave the valley with nothing except the clothes he wore. As he walked away, no one celebrated. They simply watched the man who had built his fortune upon fear disappear beyond the hills. The following season was not perfect. Some fields still struggled and some families remained poor. But something important had changed. When crops failed, neighbors searched for real causes instead of imaginary curses. When someone prospered, people celebrated honest success instead of suspecting stolen blessings. Trust slowly returned, one harvest at a time. Jabari rebuilt his father's farm with the same quiet determination that had always guided him. Standing beside healthy rows of maize, he finally understood his father's last lesson. Bitterness destroys the heart, but fear can destroy an entire community when it allows evil to hide behind myths. The villagers never again spoke of men who harvested luck. Instead, they taught their children a different truth. The greatest thief is not the one who steals your fortune, but the one who convinces you that justice is impossible before he takes it.